Afternoon, everyone. So I got the really lucky job of the right before dinner slot. So what I've decided is instead of this talk, we're just going to talk about ISO compliance for 2 hours and not let you have any dinner. No, I will stick with the scheduled talk. I think that's probably better than being murdered by a group of teams. So for those that don't know me, I am Matt Johnston. I work as a senior cloud architect and run our Southern AWS team at Leaven. I've been a cloud and security nerd for a very long time, and also get into a dabble with a bit of hardware and electronics. So I'll have to do a talk on hardware security next year, maybe. I am about the worst person at graphic design in the world, so I helpfully went to our consulting team and said, can you give me a nice PowerPoint template? Then I came yesterday and got very jealous of some of the templates, so I've decided to take our corporate thing and add random transitions to every slide, so now it's artistic. So I really hope you enjoy. And the usual disclaimer that all opinions are mine and not the employer's. So I'm going to be talking about insider attacks. So I'm going to start off with what we're going to call a case study. They get better from there, trust me. There's a lot of transitions in PowerPoint now. So before I get into this, and there's a reason case studies is in quotes, so I have to state this case study is hypothetical and not based on any actual events. The fact that it closely resembles a widely publicized security event by a company that likes suing people who talk about their security incidents is a complete coincidence. And it's unfortunate that that is a common disclaimer that has to be made in these things, because there are a lot of companies that quite like not people not talking about them, but this is why we're here to learn. So we'll talk about our hypothetical background for this case study. So we're talking about a large US technology firm working in the physical hardware space. They're a sort of classic environment of an older company that is started off quite a while ago in the traditional on-prem environments, building out into... the wrong one. Oh, now it's going to not do it at all, is it? There we go. I know how to use PowerPoint, I promise. So it's built out slowly over time, and they've started organically growing into the cloud space. So starting out with small teams that want to give launching new internal services and products into the cloud space, and then that's sort of grown into a much bigger part of the business. And they do have an entire sort of in-house mix of traditional dev and ops teams as well as modern DevOps, so quite a variety. So, the transition again. So we go into the CISO's worst nightmare. So out of the blue one day, come into the office, and an anonymous hacker has reached out with proof that they've totally hacked through your systems. Pretty much the worst day. They've claimed and proven they've got access to all of your source code, your infrastructure as code, and basically all of their internal systems that existed in the cloud space. So pretty much as thoroughly owned as you can take. They haven't confirmed that there is customer data compromised, but that's something you always have to be thinking about. It wasn't in the example data sets. And of course, what they want out of it is many millions of dollars to not talk about this. So what do you do in response to this? The first thing, obviously, you bring up your incident response team. You bring on board your key players. So you take someone from your in-house InfoSec team who becomes your incident controller. You take your cloud development lead, because this is a cloud-focused attack, and they lead the technical side of the response. And then you bring in all the really important people that us technical people like to forget about, like the comms and the legal and the finance people. Bring them all on board too, and that starts forming your response. Generally, this is the first step. If you don't have any plan to do this in response, you should probably get an incident response plan. So you start the investigation phase of response, and what do they look at? So they're looking at what has been provided by the attacker to prove it. Is this actually true? And unfortunately, the first thing they did verify is this attack was real. They had actual data out of their systems. They then found all of their access, change logs, and audit logs were empty, which is pretty much the worst next step to get into in this. So they were using, for those that are in the AWS space, CloudTrail, as well as a lot of archiving to S3 and things like that. All of that had gone. And that left a lot of questions. They also found all of their security alerting was gone. So their security hub configs were disabled, their alerting channels were out, agents disconnected, and even their downtime alerting channels were disabled. So pretty much all of their methods of detecting this sort of attack early and being able to do any sort of useful reconnaissance was gone. Interestingly, there was no sign of attempting ransomware and no obvious data loss, which in this sort of attack, especially on a high-profile company, was very peculiar to them, because it's often, ransomware in particular, especially if you have the ability to delete backups, which this person definitely did, it's such a profitable way on these attacks. So it was a really interesting finding for the security team that wasn't done, and that would have been the obvious next steps. There was also, interestingly, almost nothing modified, and there was no attempts at persistence that any other team could find. So there was no backdoors added in, no roles. It had been very much a once in, get all the data, and then gone without any attempt at maintaining persistence in the environment, which was definitely really unusual. Then things get worse for them. So because they're spending this time investigating and not paying millions of dollars, the hacker does the obvious thing here and releases to the media the fact that this hack has happened, with the goal of trying to stir them up and make them basically pay out to stop the stuff getting worse. They also show more details of data they got, showing that they were definitely in the system for a prolonged amount of time and had really extensive data. Throughout all this, though, the hacker's being very communicative, so they're keeping a very open channel of communication to the company, and, of course, doing this in a very usefully anonymous fashion. The beauty here, being a very large US company, is that your next step is really easy, because you can engage law enforcement and get all of their powers to help investigate what's happening, which is very useful, especially when you're trying to track down an active attacker. And trying to stop data getting out further. And of course, they assisted on with that unmasking. I won't go into all of the details of this step because they're not as relevant for this case study, but so OPSEC is always what bites from all sides of things. This is the physical security world, the InfoSec world. It's always OPSEC that bites on these things. So the hacker was communicating and delivering his ransoms through log-free VPNs. So the traditional VPNs in small countries on transient VPS hosts that are pretty hard to actually backtrace somebody through. Really helpfully, they had about 30 seconds where their VPN didn't connect, and their device just happily connected directly to, I forget what the messaging service, one of the big messaging services, so allowed them to actually get logs and get their IP address. This is where the law enforcement side comes in really useful, because they then trace that. It matches to a static IP at a residential address with a single person living there, who is promptly arrested, and they find copies of all the data with them. Sounds like an interesting thing, a sort of case closed, but at this point, there's already a lot of damage caused. So, interestingly, well, I have a slide missing. This is what I get for preparing my slides. Before we get to that, so who the attacker was, and this is all that last slide was. So when they found out who this IP masked to and arrested them, what they discovered was this hacker that had been going against them for all of this time was their lead cloud engineer, who was also leading the incident response. I know there's always a lot of debate in the community of who do you put on an incident response team. I don't have the answer for that, except saying not the guy hacking you is probably the starting point of how not to stop that team. So it provided a really interesting situation because it answered a lot of their questions of why their incident response hadn't found much. because when your technical lead on that side is stopping you, yeah, it was an interesting case for them, and I do not envy being any of the ones on that in that environment. So this did provide an interesting upside on the damage in that they discovered that their data technically hadn't actually ever left the control of authorized agents of the company, which their legal team was particularly happy about because they technically hadn't had a data breach, which is semantics to most people, but you know lawyers and they like semantics, and it dropped a lot of liability off. So that was quite interesting. On the other side, the PR impact was massive. So you have a big company in a network security space, so a company that's being entrusted to provide security. A hack like this is very, very damaging long term. And in the short term, it also knocked, I think it was like $500 million off their stock price while this was happening, which did rebound. But those things are massive, and it's why the US authorities get really big on attacks on these public traded companies, because there's only so much. The damage is so much wider than just their internal systems. And long term, the consumer trust. So when you're providing products in the security industry, and in the IT industry in general, if you're remembered as that company whose stuff got hacked, you're going to have a really hard time convincing customers that you're the one to protect their systems from getting damaged. So that was a really long-term impact for them. They also spent a lot of money on the incident response and management. While I covered that in about 2 minutes, it was I think about a 6-week process with round-the-clock teams working on this, and that's just their internal resource, not even considering the law enforcement effort and all of the other resources that go into this. The management time was humongous. So that's sort of what happened. The obvious follow-up question from this is what could be done differently? Because that's the idea of us going through these case studies, is what can we learn from this? What can we improve? And how can we have this not happen? So I will just preface this with a few things I really like to do on all my talks, is that emphasizing every business and environment is different. Directives without context are not useful. And what I mean by that is that I have a personal pet peeve, and I'm sure anyone here who's been audited especially has, of you will often get someone talk about something at one of the big international conferences, and suddenly every auditor requires you to do that to check a box, or you don't pass your next review. It is a very common thing, and since I've been bitten by that so many times, I refuse to provide any concrete steps in any of my talks. So I can never cause someone to do unnecessary work in their environment because I suggested something. So I will provide a lot of general context for concepts of controls and mitigations I think are relevant and what you need to think about, but no specific advice there. Also, while I do work in a company that can help you with this, I'm not trying to sell that, although I will talk on ways that companies similar to mine can play into that solution. So, talking about types of controls. So, this is usually the first thing. You go in and present to your security team, in particular CISOs, we have this new risk that we need to consider. And usually the first part of that is coming up with, we're going to whiteboard out what controls we can use to plan this. And insider attacks in particular, I think you really need to consider the two sides, the technical controls and the process. The cloud environment gives you a lot of ability to actually apply technical controls onto insider attacks, more so than on-prem ever did. In on-prem, there's a lot of damage insiders can do. You get into a data center, you can't really limit what happens then. In the cloud is great because you can force those auditing, those logging, those permission levels at such a granular level that you actually do get some options for these sorts of attacks. So I won't go into detail here, but just talking through some of the options we consider. So infrastructure as code is a really big one, and this underpins a lot of them in that if you have your infrastructure documented, it's really obvious if someone tries to change anything. assuming everyone has drift detection and all of these fancy things that we never have budget to implement. But that's, I think, the underpinning that relies most of these other things. Break glass in terms of, I don't mean this in the terms of the emergency access, but core permissions such as getting into your auditing and logging accounts shouldn't be something you can normally get into. And I'm really big on making those in a break glass form, so it's really obvious to everybody. For example, and this sounds like a concrete instruction, but it's just an example of when of a lot of the systems I build will design anyone who goes into that logging account, it emails basically everyone in tier 1. Because you want as many people as possible to know when that sort of stuff is happening, because it shouldn't normally be happening. Similarly, immutable logging. So immutable logging is talking about pushing your logs to a place where they can't be edited or deleted. And there is a lot of security recommendations, and I'll go against what a lot of the cloud providers here say, which is you push that to another account in your organization, lock that off, and there's your secure immutable logs. And that doesn't work if it's someone that actually has access to all of these accounts. So I think it's really important that you consider another source, whether that's pulling logging out to on-prem, pulling it to another cloud provider. I'm a big fan of some of the SaaS logging providers that do their own external log shipping, because it's a separate class, things like that. It's something that needs to be considered, because a lot of those traditional approaches, especially in cloud, aren't as separated as you'd like. Change alerting is another big one, and this goes in similar to the break glassing of making sure that people know when things are changing, particularly security controls. And this is where your cloud controls come in really good, because you can alert anytime specific actions in your infrastructure happen, and there's many of those, like in our case study, changing the retention period on your audit logs is something that should never actually happen. So having an alerting process that ships that out to everyone in the team makes sense, because that's not going to be noise, because that should never happen. Similarly, disabling your alerting paths should probably alert to everyone. The other one these two are the really obvious ones that everyone talks about in security is, so environmental isolation. So keeping separation between not just your production and development environments, but also between different team projects and things like that. So minimizing what an insider is. And it's important to get across to people, and this can be really tricky with egos sometimes in this industry, that just because you're our trusted senior architect on this project doesn't mean you should have any access to the other projects, or doesn't mean you should have production access. And that's not because we don't trust you, it's just because you don't need that for your job. And that follows into least privilege as well. I think that they're very much tied in together there. And getting that across can be a challenge in some organizations, especially when you have senior people that have been with companies for a very long time. And I often see this, especially in management, where you have people who progress up to the executive layer out of engineering and retain all their low-level access to systems. And that can be a really hard organizational sort of barrier to get past. Then we get into the part that is much harder than the technical controls, which is the process stuff, because people become this is inherently a problem with people. We can put technical controls in front of it, but we're managing people here. So pen testing is something that I don't think I have to persuade anyone in this room is a good idea. But it's something that I think people need to consider at a very high level and at all levels of their system, not just at a project level. Code review is something that a lot of people do wrong. I find code review is one of the most helpful things to this, especially if that ties in with change management, which is a bit further down. That needs to be done, and not just by someone in the team. You need those processes that trigger code reviews out to your security teams or your expert that's on a completely different development team that can cross-check that a team is not colluding together to do bad things. All that sort of stuff you can do, and that comes down to the processes and how you organize that. Staff vetting is a big one. Anyone that's gone through, I believe 27001 has a lot of good vetting stuff in it usually, and there's a lot of those frameworks talk about this a lot, and it's something that a lot of people glaze over. And you don't want to take this too extreme, because you don't want to discriminate against people because of what they've done in the past, but you also need to be aware of that when giving access with particular systems. It's a tough balance between discrimination and opportunity there, but it's something that you'd need to address and need to have a conscious thought about. Change management is everyone's favorite thing in the IT industry, particularly developers, but forms a really important part of this, and getting that consideration and buy-in from security. Similarly, two-person deploys is a big one for me, having someone not being able to change environments without tie-in from someone outside the team, and design forums, which is not... I say design forums, and everyone in their head pictures the stuffy architecture forum they've been to where they spend 2 hours debating a minor change to their application. And this doesn't have to be that. It can just be having collaborative catch-ups with all of your team, including your juniors and whoever else, just talking about your architectures. And this really helps for security, because people will catch if you're trying to sneak in a bad idea. And particularly building a culture where people aren't afraid to speak up if you have a bad idea. It's one of the things I try and teach, particularly interns and juniors, is just because you're speaking to a senior architect that's been there for 30 years and is an expert on this product, don't be afraid to tell them you think their idea is terrible, because sometimes it is. And usually that's an accident, but there are those one cases where that might be intentional. So the problem that follows on from controls is bootstrapping. How do you know what controls you need, and how do you get there? And this is really important for companies that go through organic growth into new environments, and particularly for startups. I see a lot of this in the small to medium business industry in New Zealand, where they just start getting into needing proper IT. And the route often goes, they hire that friend of a cousin who's really good with IT, who then grows into the IT management role, and then they build up enough, they go into the MSP world, and it extends out from there. And that can lead to a lot of bad practices. And this is the thing of finding the right people. How do you know who to give you that advice of how to build your systems securely, how to build them properly, and how do you even know as a business person that you need to involve someone who knows about security early on? I don't have a good answer to that. If anyone does have a good answer to that problem, I'd love to hear it, because I don't think it's a solved problem in security. And it's more a business management question than a security one. But yeah, the common approach that people will recommend is, for a small business, you don't have the ability to do that internally, go to an MSP or some other form of agency or large organization. That can work, but it's definitely not a solution for everyone. It's not a cheap solution, and it does have a lot of drawbacks as well in terms of flexibility. This is a case where I can actually recommend people look towards things like compliance frameworks early on in businesses, even if you're not specifically needing them, because while they can be overboard to actually get certified in areas, having that baseline to know what you need to do, especially for business people, having that evidence showing this is our best practice. For instance, looking at something like PCI, you don't necessarily want to go the whole way, but the guidelines that recommends can help get that management on board and know that these are the things you need to be thinking about. Similarly, there is the cost versus benefit of it, because as a very small company, like the way to avoid insider attacks is never have one person do anything. However, the cost of that in a small company is just really not practical. If you're saying you can't afford to have any IT until you can hire 2 people in every role, or 3 so they can't disagree on anything, just doesn't work. So security controls are always going to be a cost versus benefit, but it's making sure that your early decisions don't lock you out of good practice. I've running slightly short on time, so I'll go through these ones quickly. After you bootstrap, the ongoing management is a really tricky one, keeping those practices in place. Separation of duties, making sure that teams have their areas and focus on those, also means that there tends to be more eyes on a problem. Mandatory leave, don't know if anyone has anyone here worked in a financial organization or role that has mandatory block leave? Okay, a couple of people. For those that don't know, a lot of particularly banks and senior finance roles have a policy where you have to take usually like 2 or 4 weeks of block leave each year in one go, where you're basically banned from the building, all your devices are taken away. They're often very strict on it at the high end. And the goal of that is that it stops financial fraud because someone else has to do your month for a reporting cycle. And you catch these things. And I think this is something that particularly the security community should be doing, not just because I want another month of annual leave every year. But I think the benefits would be really strong in catching that, the fresh eyes on things and making sure that you don't have those gaps. Similarly, the shared ownership, making sure, again, this is about engaging more people and getting everyone understanding how things are and contributing to that work. External review as well. All the account managers in the room will hate me, but occasionally use a different provider for your pen test, or get someone else to do your annual review 1 year. This is just really important, again, for avoiding collusion and for maximizing those eyes on. And again, all the non-management people can be here. Consider doing more auditing. I know that's an unpopular stance, but there are cases where it's really useful. Obviously, that has to be contextual and in the right place. And lastly, it's about trying to prioritize structured growth over organic growth. You don't want those environments that have grown out of one person on your team wanted to try a technology. Now that's the base of our entire organization's cloud strategy. And no one's thought about this. That's a surprisingly common cloud migration strategy that I see in my day job. And trying to avoid that. And similarly to shadow IT, the organic growth is more about endorsed IT, but where it gets delegated to one person. Shadow IT is even worse, where no one even knows that's happening until one day you go, half our organization relies on this technology. So finally, my last thoughts on this. So the key to protecting against this is your foundation of all your technical environments, particularly cloud, but anywhere in your organization. Sometimes you get to a point where you don't want to be able to fix a system. You just have to tear it down and replace it properly and structured. There's always the cost arguments against that, but I think it becomes necessary at some points. You need to always ask for help early and often. That's both internally from your external providers, from advisors, even if that's just getting advice from other similar businesses on LinkedIn. It's whatever. You need that. Avoiding the bus factor, never have your one person in a role, particularly senior security roles, ITSMs, major security approvers, roles like that. You need multiple people across at least aspects of that. And lastly, the bit that our internal IT security manager hated when I gave this talk on Tuesday, you need to be constantly thinking in your own organizations, how could I destroy my employer's business today? And you need to be thinking about that constantly. And if you come up with a way, you need to identify that and get it on your risk register. You also need to make sure to tell everyone else in your company to do this as well. So thank you very much. That is my chat on insider security. If anyone has any questions or thoughts, I will be around over dinner. Feel free to reach out. I love talking about this stuff. Thank you.